Bonjour. Welcome to Alliance Française, to our online cultural programs. My name is Natasha Zawadzka. Here with us, we have today our special guest, Dr. Philip Mansel, who's live from London, and who will be talking about one of the most captivating figures in French history, Louis XIV. And also we have Sarah Diligenti, our executive director of Alliance Française here. And before we start, I just wanted to remind that all participants today, you can use a special code to have a 30% discount on the book. And let me just put it in chat. So you have the link actually right here. If you would like to get the copy, this is the most up-to-date and the most comprehensive biography of Louis XIV, and you will see that it has magnificent illustrations, some of which you will have a chance to see today on the big screen. So now let me introduce Dr. Philip Mansel to you. Dr. Philip Mansel is one of Britain's leading historians on France and the Middle East. He has lived in Paris, Istanbul, Beirut, and now resides in London. Philip Mansel has written more than a dozen books, including the one on history of Paris as capital of Europe in the early 19th century, Paris between empires, the eagle in splendor, inside the court of Napoleon. This is just to mention a few. He has lived and taught in Paris, and 6 of his books have been translated into French. He is président du conseil scientifique du Centre de recherche du Château de Versailles. So he's the president of the scientific council of the research center of Château de Versailles. Dr. Mansel also won the Franco-British Book Prize for his most recent book, The Life of Louis XIV, which he will be presenting today with a special twist on Louis XIV as the royal feminist. His books have been translated into several languages, including French, Italian, German, Greek, Turkish, and Arabic. So I'm handing it over to you, Dr. Mansel, right now. I will be helping on the technical side with the slides, and Sarah will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions, you can enter them actually anytime in the chat, but we will be doing the Q&A session after the presentation. And meanwhile, please don't forget to always be on mute before the Q&A. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I wish I could be with you, but maybe in the future. I'm speaking from England, and I'm talking about Louis XIV, who's been haunting me for the last 10 years, really, preparing my book. And I think one of the more unexpected sides is the role and power of women in his life. Next slide, please. And this is part of the tradition of the French court, of his world. And that's the Society for Court Studies. Yes, this slide, this shows a French lady-in-waiting, Christine de Pizan, in the early 15th century, with one of her books called The Treasure of the City of Ladies, which may be the first feminist book in European literature. She says men and women have the same qualities and the same virtues and should really have the same power. Why can she say this? Because she, like many ladies in France, was part of the power structure. She's a lady in waiting of the queen, and queens of France often had households, courts, as large as the kings, their sons or husbands or fathers. And this is the background to Louis XIV's admiration for women. Next slide, please. This is Louis XIV's grandmother, Marie de Médicis, the widow of Henri IV, painted by Rubens. She's wearing black because Henri IV had been assassinated, the grandfather of Louis XIV. And she was a real power in the land. She's regent of France when Louis XIII, her son, is king, is very young, but she's also sitting in the council as a fully influential member in the 1620s when he's of adult age. So the queen was expected to be part of the power structure. And in fact, she was frequently raising rebellions against her son, and in the end died in exile. Next, please. And here is another part of the background of Louis XIV's admiration for women.
This is this remarkable book published under Louis XIV with his emblem of the 2 entwined L's on the cover. de l'égalité des deux sexes, discours physique et moral où l'on voit l'importance de se défaire des préjugés, by a man called François Poulain de la Barre, of the equality of the two sexes, physical and moral discourse, where you see the importance of ridding yourself of prejudices. And this is really quite a brave demonstration of the equality of men and women and the ridiculousness of prejudices against women. And it's published with the king's approval, avec privilège du roi. So there is both a political reality of female power through the court and the queen's household. And the queen's household is often as big as or even larger than the king's. And there is a constant discussion about women's rights and women's equality with men. And it's particularly in France, I think, because of the monarchy and the court and the role of the queen. And Paris in general, and the court in particular, was known as the paradise of women. They had more power and more freedom than women in London, for example. Next, please. And it's common through French women outside France. This is a lady called Louise de Gonzague de Nevers, who becomes Queen of Poland. Louis XIV knew her, he had danced with her at her wedding, and it was said that she completely dominated her husband, King Władysław IV of Poland. And it said she was like she guided her gigantic, very fat husband as easily as an elephant driver guides an elephant. And in fact, she tried to save Poland from foreign invaders. This is the 1650s and 60s. She herself witnesses battles. She's a real political force. And this was the norm in the 17th century. It's not really an exception. Next slide, please. And here you see the next king of Poland, Jan Sobieski, king of Poland, and he's with his wife, who is another agent of French power and corresponding directly with Louis XIV. She's called Marie-Casimir Louise de la Grange d'Arquien. She also has huge influence over her husband. And through Louis XIV, she's promoting a French-Polish alliance and is promoting her family's power. She was called Maricientka. Next slide, please. And here you have another French princess ruling, dominating another monarchy. This is Savoy-Piedmont. And this shows Marie-Jeanne Baptiste de Savoie, Duchesse de Savoie, also constantly corresponding with Louis XIV as a political operator in her own right, a stronger character than her husband, who dies young. And in the 1670s and 1680s, she is ruling Piedmont, a very important Italian state of the time, and ruling in the French interest. And you can see an expression of her power. If you go to Turin, you see the Palazzo Madama, which is almost as large, with a staircase almost as grand as the royal palace itself. Next slide, please. And there she is again, as a widow. You see she's in black and white, a very powerful political operator. Next, please. And here you have her sister, the Queen of Portugal, Marie-Françoise Elizabeth de Nemours, and she has an extraordinary life. She marries one king of Portugal called Afonso VI. She hates him. This is 1667. He has lewd women in the palace, grooms, blacks, and Moorish slaves. So she runs away to a convent and leads a coup d'etat against her husband with her brother-in-law, who's a far better bet as a husband. And in fact, she deposes the King of Portugal. She marries her brother-in-law and becomes Queen of Portugal a second time with Pedro II, who treats her far better. And she again is a powerful figure, and she says she enjoys all the freedom that I want to take in Portugal, although she admitted it did not reach the level of French freedom. So you see the background to Louis XIV. There are these very powerful political operators, though Paris is always regarded as synonymous with freedom for women. They had more opportunity there to go out in the city, for example, without their husbands. Next slide, please. And here you see another lady, Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, the first cousin of Louis XIV. She marries the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1661. The marriage doesn't work, although she has 3 children by him. And with Louis XIV's approval, she leaves her husband, which is really a very brave act in the 17th century, and comes back to live in Paris. Her husband pays for her upkeep, and she lives a very free life with many boyfriends in the royal guard. And she is supported by Louis XIV in her decision to leave her husband. Next slide, please. There she is again, a bust by Giovanni Battista Foggini. I think you can see the power and independence in her face. Next slide, please. Now let's get back to Louis XIV. Born in 1638, a longed-for Dauphin, hailed more or less like a new Jesus Christ, born to late in the day to a mother who had been barren. And here he is with his wet nurse, Madame de Longuet. Next slide, please. And for the first 7 years of his life, he is brought up by Madame de Lansac on the left, Gouvernante des Enfants de France, a very important position. We'll come to that at the end of the talk. And here he is on the throne, because he becomes king in 1643 after the death of his father, with his younger brother, Monsieur, Duc d'Orléans. Next slide, please. Here he is again with his brother, praying to Jesus and God in heaven, protected by St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. And on the right is the key figure of his youth, perhaps the main woman in his life, his mother, Anne of Austria. Born a Spanish infanta, she becomes completely French, and she rules as regent when he's young. And somehow in the revolutionary movement known as the Fronde, she keeps the French monarchy going in a very difficult situation. And 1666, she dies. Louis XIV is devastated. It may be the beginning of his hatred of Paris, because his mother had died there in the Louvre Palace. And he says after her death, she wasn't like a queen of France, she was one of the very greatest kings France had ever had. And he reveres her and reveres her power. Next slide, please. There he is as a young king. Underneath him is a figure of rebellion. He is suppressing the rebellion of the Fronde, which ends in 1652. He'd been helped and advised by his mother all through the rebellion. Next slide, please. And he's brought up with a series of sisters known as the Mazarinettes, the nieces of Cardinal Mazarin, the all-powerful chief minister. And this is a very strange picture by Jacob Vouet in the Royal Collection in London. Hortense Mancini on the left, niece of Cardinal Mazarin, is telling the fortune of her sister Marie Mancini on the right, who is in fact Louis XIV's first love. He falls passionately in love with her, with this young woman not of royal birth, in 1659 to 1660, and he almost marries her. Again, a sign of the power of women in his life. Unfortunately, the letters between them don't survive. But if they did, they would show him as far more romantic and less conventional than we generally imagine. And there she is again. And it's a picture I took. She was packed off to Rome by her uncle, who really feared a marriage between the two, which would have scandalized France and Europe and lowered the prestige of the French monarchy. And she married Prince Colonna. She didn't really like Rome. It was quite dull compared to Paris and the French court. But when you go round the Palazzo Colonna, when we can all get back to traveling after COVID, you will see it's not really a come down. It's very grand and very luxurious, and lots of portraits of Marie Mancini. And she leaves her husband. Again, Louis XIV doesn't really condemn her for that. Her French pension is kept. She writes her memoirs, and she leaves a wandering but always independent life until she dies the same year as Louis XIV in 1715. Next slide, please. And here are two ladies of the French court, a series of pictures of French court ladies that you can see in a museum in Le Mans in France, the Musée Tessé, and also in Skoklöster Castle in Sweden. I think they were mass produced and handed round to French nobles or foreign monarchs to show how glorious the French court was. They're extremely well dressed, and they are riding side saddle, showing that they participate in the country activities of the French court. In many countries, women riding would have been thought slightly scandalous. Louis XIV, in fact, encouraged it, as you can see in these pictures. And on the left is Olympe Mancini, who had also been a girlfriend of Louis XIV, another niece of Cardinal Mazarin. She's in front of the royal palace of Vincennes, and she's later involved in this scandalous, slightly mysterious affair of the poisons, when various ladies of the court in 1680 were accused of having attended black masses or bought poisons to bump off their husband. It is all slightly vague. It may really have been an intrigue launched by Louvois to terrify his rivals in power. It's not certain. On the right is the Duchesse de La Ferté in front of the Palace of Saint-Germain, where Louis XIV was born. These ladies would always accompany Louis XIV when out riding or hunting, which is really his main leisure activity as a young man. Next slide, please. Here you see Louis XIV, much older, followed by ladies when he's out hunting in front of Meudon, just outside Paris, one of the many wonderful palaces which were surrounded by hunting forests. You see the prominence of women in these pictures of the French court. Next slide, please. 1660, he has to dump Marie Mancini, and he's dragged to the Spanish frontier, and he's married off to the Infanta Maria Theresa of Spain, who is, in fact, incredibly, his double first cousin, which doesn't augur well for the health of their children. But they did have a son who survived, the Dauphin. You see him there greeting the King of Spain, Philip IV, and to the right is Maria Theresa. To the left, in black, is his mother, Anne of Austria. The two most powerful courts in Europe meeting more or less as equals exactly on the frontier line between France and Spain. Next slide, please. Here is his much mistreated wife, Marie-Thérèse, as Queen of France in a fleur-de-lis covered robe. It's a picture in the Museum of Angers. She was frequently humiliated. The mistresses of Louis XIV were given better jewels, more power. They were more the center of court life. But at least in the main palaces, the king always shared her bed at night, which was very unusual for the time. Normally, kings and queens slept apart. So again, that shows the emotional side of Louis XIV. Although he had many girlfriends, he believed on a certain level in family life. Next slide, please. And here you see the whole French royal family. It's about 1669. It's a picture by Nocret, which is now in the Palace of Versailles. And please note, most of the characters are women, not men. On the right is his first cousin, the Grande Mademoiselle, as Diana. They're painted as gods of Olympus. I'll be coming to her later. Then there's the Queen in front with her children. There's Louis XIV himself as Apollo, of course, as he was always shown. Then there's some cousins. There's his mother, Anne of Austria. Then holding flowers is his sister-in-law, the Duchesse d'Orléans, who was sister of Charles II of England, her husband, Monsieur Duc d'Orléans, and on the far left is Henrietta Maria, the widow of Charles I of England, who was born a French princess and frequently lived in France. And all these figures had a political side to their careers. They're very much part of the French monarchy. You can't just call it a patriarchy. It also has aspects of matriarchy. Next slide, please. And here is his sister-in-law again, the Duchesse d'Orléans. She died young in 1670, but not before she'd been used as a diplomat by Louis XIV and Charles II to negotiate directly with the two kings a treaty between France and England, which later led to a joint attack on the Netherlands. And the letters survive, and they're all about politics. They're not about court life or family relationships. She's really a major player in European high diplomacy. Next slide, please. And now we must turn to Louis XIV's love life, these mistresses. This is a picture by Mignard of his first girlfriend after his marriage, Louise de la Valliere, and their two children. And on the right, there's a rather sad inscription, Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world, because she was soon dumped after about 1670 in favor of Madame de Maintenon. But her children are recognized, they are legitimized, they are raised to high semi-royal rank, and she was made a duchess. She ends up reverting to the pious Catholicism of her youth, and she has a backup world away from the court, the world to which many women fled, maybe particularly in France, the world of the convent, which is really a female power base and rival to the world of the court. Convents have their own estates, their own money, their own female power structure. They're ruled by abbesses. And she, in fact, left there. She went to a particularly strict convent, but she renounced the king and the court really quite openly. It's quite a bold move. When asked if she had a message for the king by her replacement as his principal mistress, Madame de Maintenon, she said, with, in my opinion, a note of contempt, "You can tell him anything you want, madame, anything you want." She really didn't care anymore. Next slide, please. And here is her replacement. I'm sorry, it's a bit blurred, but this is a remarkable picture showing her as Europe on the bull, which takes Europe to Europe. She, again, showing her as a goddess of classical mythology, a triumphant royal mistress. Next slide, please. Here she is in the house Louis XIV built for her at Clagny. It no longer exists. Living in luxury. Please note the lacquer cabinets in the background in her gallery, with on top of them the great luxury object of the time, blue and white Chinese porcelain. She was, again, a key power figure, very influential. The king spent a lot of time alone with her. He relaxed with her. It's she who promotes Racine and Molière to be favorite playwrights at the court, many other writers also, and she's the center of a network of patronage, because the French court isn't just a royal power base, it's also a job center for everybody in France asking for jobs. And if you went through Madame de Montespan, it increased your likelihood of getting jobs. Next slide, please. Here you see her again. This is a design for a fan in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, with lots of little cupids everywhere, symbols of love, again, great luxury. It may represent the interior of a building which no longer exists, called the Trianon de Porcelaine, or the Porcelain Trianon, lined with blue and white tiles, which was for Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan alone. They would meet there in the afternoon. It was almost literally a love nest. She was openly acknowledged as a mistress. She would have royal bodyguards to protect her, in part against her husband. Court preachers would denounce her, would denounce the king's commerce, as they called it, with his mistresses in front of the king, but it had absolutely no effect. They continued to live as they wished. Next slide, please. Here she is again as a repentant Mary Magdalene. It is in a place called Goodwood House, full of French treasures in England. But by 1678, she's beginning to lose her looks. The king is beginning to look elsewhere. He was famous for his roving eye. And the affair of the poisons, the scandal of the poisons, which sort of begins to break in 1679 to 80, and she is involved. Nobody really knows how true these allegations were, but she certainly had some disreputable friends. So she's on the way out. And the king begins to, next slide, please. And this is another lady, a friend of Madame de Montespan, called Louise de Kérou, who had been an attendant of the Duchesse d'Orléans, whom we saw earlier. She's sent to England. She becomes Charles II's main mistress. She's also an agent of Louis XIV, working with the French ambassador to keep England pro-French. And it was said that the true center of government in England in the 1670s and 80s, it wasn't where the ministers lived, it was in her luxurious apartment in Whitehall Palace. She is with an African girl, probably an enslaved servant, holding pearls and coral. And I wish I knew the exact symbolism, because they come into other portraits. It may symbolize the sea, which Louise de Kérou frequently crossed on her way between London and Paris. And she's holding up her dress to reveal the tabouret or stool, which duchesses only were allowed to sit on at the French court. It's a very hard-won privilege, and she had earned it as mistress of Charles II, and she becomes a duchess in her own right, both in England as Duchess of Portsmouth and in France as Duchesse d'Aubigny. Next slide, please. And here we see another of Mazarin's nieces, Hortense Mancini. She lives in England. She has become, in fact, an enemy of Louis XIV. Again, an independent operator, another woman who has left her husband with the blessing of Louis XIV, living in independence. Next slide, please. And here you see the Duchesse de Bouillon, another of the nieces of Mazarin, from that series of court ladies riding horses. Next slide, please. Another of Louis XIV's girlfriends, the Princess de Rohan. She's wearing a lot of jewels, maybe to suggest that the king had given them to her. She founds the power of the Rohan family, which lasts all through the 18th century in France. Next slide, please. And here is the Duchesse de Fontanges, a young girl thought to be of heavenly beauty. She looked and moved like a goddess, it was said, 1679 to 80. Again, she's talked about in French official newspapers. She's very beautiful. She's tall, blonde, with good skin, blue eyes, and 1,000 beautiful qualities of body and mind. But the king looked at her at chapel with more devotion than he looked at the altar, it was said, but she died young, suffering injuries from a stillbirth. Next slide, please. And here is the king's cousin, painted about 1680, the Grande Mademoiselle. She also lives as an independent woman with the king's approval. She challenges her father and wins for control of her fortune. She builds palaces as she wishes. She chooses her own husband, a very unsuitable man who cheated her and left her, called the Duc de Lauzun. Next slide, please. But she also writes her memoirs, which I recommend to all of you, Mémoires de Mademoiselle de Montpensier, because they're all about being an independent woman, making your own decisions in the reign of Louis XIV. Very frank, quite critical of the king, who had in fact diddled her out a part of her fortune, not all of it, which she left to his illegitimate children by Madame de Montespan. It is typical of the French court, of all courts, the focus on inheritances, who gets what from whom, and so on, but very readable. It's a woman's view of power and money and love affairs at the court of Louis XIV. There is an edition in print in French, and there should be a new English edition. Next slide, please. And here is another memoir by a woman, by Madame de Motteville, who writes about Anne of Austria. She had been her première femme de chambre. Again, a fascinating view of power, the Fronde, the reign of Louis XIV, from a woman's point of view. Very critical of Louis XIV. She says he only thought of himself. He didn't really care for his mother. I think that's an exaggeration. I think he did care and did his best for her. Next slide, please. And I've talked about the French court as a paradise of women. I just want to say what happened at other courts. Here is a contemporary called Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, married to the future George I of England, living in Hanover. She had a French Protestant mother. Her husband has girlfriends. She, after the birth of these two children, has a boyfriend called Count Königsmark. And in fact, he is murdered by her husband. She is locked up for 37 years in a country palace. 37 years for behaving just as her husband had done. I don't think that would have been possible in France. In other courts, women really were not free. Next slide, please. And here is Louis XIV's last love, the very intelligent, very powerful Madame de Maintenon. She'd begun as governess of his illegitimate children. She wins the king's favor in 1680. I'll just quote some letters of Madame de Sévigné, another brilliant female observer of the court. 1680, the favor of Madame de Maintenon is increasing every day. There are infinite conversations with His Majesty. Conversations of a length which makes everyone wonder. Ministers courted her as much as ministers were courted by others. The favor of Madame de Maintenon is still supreme. That's 1680, and it lasts until the king's death in 1715. Again, she probably became his morganatic wife, his secret wife. He visits her the whole time. He works with ministers in her apartment. She becomes part of the power structure. All the letters to her and from her have been published recently in France. They show that people tell her the news, they ask her for jobs. Members of the royal family send messages for the king through her. She is consulted about more or less everything. And Madame de Montespan also retires, her rival retires to a convent, exactly like Louise de la Valliere. And I will quote one letter from Louis XIV to her. I always cherish you and I respect you to an extent which I cannot express. And indeed, whatever affection you have for me, I have even more for you, being with all my heart totally yours. So this ruthless monarch also had a heart. And she didn't really like court life. She didn't really like being surrounded by other ladies, the royal family, male courtiers. But for the king's sake, she put up with it. But she also had an alternative world. Next slide, please. This is the school of Saint-Cyr, which Louis XIV built for her at huge cost, where 200 young noblewomen were given a very good modern education in French, Latin, dance, deportment, whatever it was thought young ladies should learn in the 1680s. There you see, it's a sort of recreation, Louis XIV in conversation with Madame de Maintenon in front of the school. And Madame de Maintenon would go there to get away from the court, because the court isn't just a closed world, far from it. It's the center of all the avenues and networks of France, and you could escape from it to a house, to Paris, to your estates, or in Madame de Maintenon's case, to Saint-Cyr. But the girls were taught that marriage was a tribulation, good husbands almost unknown. They should suffer in silence. The only true happiness lay in conformity to the will of God. Men were the masters, women should suffer with good grace. And so it goes on. The later reign of Louis XIV is full of military disasters. He overreaches himself. Next slide, please. Here you see Louis XIV reviewing his troops, and next to him is Madame de Maintenon in public. So he's not hiding her from the rest of France. Next slide, please. Here you see Louis XIV's granddaughter-in-law, the Duchesse de Bourgogne, who comes to France in 1698, a very powerful influence on him. She keeps the court young and lively. She is the center of court life, and she's allowed to choose and run her own household, a great privilege for a young princess. Next slide, please. And that's a part of the decoration of the royal apartments at Versailles, when the king famously said, we must have jeunesse partout, we must have youth everywhere. It's not as dull and rigid as some people allege. Next slide, please. And here is another powerful political woman. This is in the 1670s. It is a portrait of a French woman born Mademoiselle de la Trémouille, who marries Prince Orsini and is known as the Princesse des Ursins. In France and Rome, she speaks French, Italian, and Spanish, because she'd had a Spanish period, and she's sent to Madrid as Louis XIV's agent when his grandson, Philip V, is proclaimed King of Spain after 1700. And she really runs the Spanish government, partly runs it with the French ambassador, with the king, the queen. She's head of the queen's household, and with some of the ministers. And she visits Louis XIV. She almost has a treaty with Louis XIV, almost as an equal. And her letters with Madame de Maintenon are absolutely fascinating documents about Europe and power and war in the 1700s. And in fact, when she revisited Madrid, 3rd of August, 1705, it is like an apotheosis. The king and queen, all the grandees of Spain, they come out from Madrid to greet her carriage, popular acclamations. They say, long life to the Camerara Mayor. the most august, the finest, and the most numerous cortege which has ever been seen. Again, a woman of power who is publicly acknowledged to have power. Now I'm coming to the end of the time. And again, and there has been a conference on her recently, and there will be more books about her and how she operated as a public politician. Next slide, please. This is Louis XIV towards the end of his life, 1713. He's receiving the Crown Prince of Saxony, and the figure in the middle is his sister-in-law, the second Duchesse d'Orléans, called Madame Elisabeth Charlotte or Liselotte of the Palatinate. And she writes brilliant letters describing the court of Versailles from her point of view, very critical of the king. She detested Madame de Maintenon. She called her mouse droppings. She hated her low birth and her power. And these letters have been published in French. There isn't a good modern edition in English, but again, you see a woman being part of the power structure and a very important observer of the French court. Next slide, please. Here you see her painted by Laguillière in royal robes. There should be a better critical edition of all her letters. She spent her life writing letters in her study to cousins in Germany, to friends in London, and so on. Next slide, please. And this is the last picture in this presentation. It shows 4 generations of the French royal family, maybe by Laguillière. It's in the Wallace collection in London. Louis XIV, leaning on the chair behind him, is his son, the Dauphin, a very important person at court who attends the Council of Ministers, but he died young in 1711. The king's sorrow at his death would have made a stone weep, it was said. He was very devoted to his family. On the right is the Duc de Bourgogne, his grandson, full of promise, but he also died young in 1712. Louis XIV didn't always have good judgment in generals or ministers or even his own doctors, and it's thought the doctors killed them with their attempted cures. On the little grandson is the Duc de Bretagne, who also dies young, but his brother, the Duc d'Anjou, will become Louis XV. Louis XIV was succeeded by his great-grandson, who then reigned till 1774. And the lady in black on the left is not very well known, but she was gouvernante des enfants de France, the royal governess. By removing her young princes from the authority of the royal doctors, she may have saved their lives. She's the single woman in the history of the French court who has had a job as a lady-in-waiting or governess for longest, for almost 60 years, from 1686 to 1746. So we began with a lady-in-waiting, we're finishing with a lady-in-waiting. She's very important, looking after the young king, and it is she who takes the initiative after Louis XIV's death to write some of his dying words and have them framed and put next to the young king's bed, where he said he should have maintained peace and that he had continued his wars and his buildings out of vanity. And she's trying to give a political lesson to Louis XV, that he should look after the welfare of his subjects rather than make wars and build palaces. But it's a lesson which unfortunately he did not heed. Anyway, I hope I have shown to you that women had a lot of power at the court of Louis XIV. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mansel. And I think we've got a lot of questions, and I'll let Sarah read some of them.
Yeah, I have a few questions because what I've been doing while you were speaking, Mr. Mansel, Dr. Mansel, sorry, I have been entering the name of each lady from the portrait so that people could actually see the name. And I actually thank you for starting with Christine de Pizan, who is a wonderful writer. I took a class of medieval poetry a few years ago back at the Alliance Française, and she was one of the first female French poets, Italian born, but she wrote in French, and she wrote beautiful poems. So I thank you very much for that. So and I replied about there was a question about the lady who ruled Piedmont, so I replied that. But a very good question from Melanie. She has a few questions actually, Melanie. The first one was, how did all these women that you talked about that became queen, how did they come to be queens?
Yes. Oh, okay, if I'm, say, King of Portugal, I send an ambassador to Paris. French women had a lot of prestige. They were thought to be well educated. And he would look around and you would see who was on the market. It was literally a marriage market. And you would choose the best, the most elegant, or the one who had the best reputation, whose family had the best reputation, and also whose family had a reputation for fecundity, because the only thing that really mattered was having an heir. That came first. But you also wanted to marry a grand person. So Louis XIV married his double first cousin, which was biological madness.
Absolutely. So we have a few more questions about trade. How are the courts making their money? Trade, investment, new France trade taxes, and if they had, because one of the painting was showing a Chinese porcelain, if they had Chinese porcelain, did that mean they were trading silver for tea and these or other items like silk? Was it the Silk Road? What was the link between France and China, for instance?
Okay, courts make money by direct taxes on the poor in France, la taille, which hit people, but also at the end of his reign, Louis XIV does tax nobles and princes because he's in a desperate situation. But he's also very interested in trade, and he himself founds trading companies and tells his relations, you've got to invest in them. They didn't always work well, but he's far closer to trade and business than we imagine. He would sit with merchants in, say, Lille, after he conquered Lille, saying, well, what do you want from me? What can we do for trade in Lille? And the same with Paris and his great minister, Colbert. Everything goes well when Colbert's alive. Everything goes badly after he dies. Yeah. He's very keen on trade. I mean, France is still living off what Colbert did for the luxury trades. And they are beginning to trade with China. 1696, the first boat goes from Nantes, I think, to China, the first French boat. But before that, they had got blue and white porcelain through Holland, because the Dutch were everywhere before the French. The Dutch and the English had got a head start, and it very much worries Louis XIV and Colbert. It's slightly like today, what can we do to catch up with the English and the others and the Americans? But the French are beginning to be everywhere, commercially, particularly in the Ottoman Empire. And there's this wonderful book called Le Parfait Négociant, which comes out in the 1670s under Louis XIV. Everybody's keen on making money, even if they don't appear to be.
Yeah. A question from Catherine. Is there anything actually which touches a little bit of what we were talking about before the event started? Is there anything we can say about the legacy of Louis XIV and the role of women in France today, or is this much more multifactorial equation?
I think from the point of view of the power and prestige of women, it began to go backwards in the 18th century, and the French Revolution is, as we know from some of the pamphlets, it is partly anti-women, partly because they're associated with the Catholic Church also. And I think Louis XIV's respect for women was not so much shared by the later French court. But he does make Versailles I mean, a showcase for women, for balls, theatres, operas. He even uses a few women in the choir of the Royal Chapel, which is really unconventional for the time. But I think it's him personally, and it goes backwards later.
Mhm. Another question from Melanie. So then was it the clergy that demanded that women submit to their husbands? How is it that French women got to be so independent at that time? Many of the French women who ran the boarding schools for the wealthy families in America and in London exerted a strong influence, Mary Todd Lincoln, Eleanor Roosevelt, and many more. But how was it the clergy in France that demanded that women submit to their husband? And how is it that French women get to be so independent at that time?
The theory is, yes, women must submit to their husband, and Madame de Maintenon says all that in her precepts for the girls of Saint-Cyr, but it's not always practiced, and even the theory of convents, of female power in convents, sort of contradicts that. And Madame de Maintenon, in her letters, is in fact criticizing the king, indirectly, but she's saying, oh, we must have peace. Well, Louis XIV loved war, and he went on fighting far too long. And she even has this wonderful phrase, we must serve the king despite himself, i.e. she's going behind his back, choosing people. And Louis XIV realized that also.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the power of convents, and then a certain legal traditions of the coutume de Paris, and the financial system for wives and widows also favored French women. I think they had a better deal than in England at that time.
Mm-hmm. What's the what would you say would be the Louis XIV's investment in New France? Did he invested a lot in New France or not?
I'm sorry I didn't mention that. He invested a lot. He's corresponding with the military commander in Quebec. He's very interested in it. At Marly, his private palace, they would talk about the Mississippi, how to get it, and he encourages emigration. But the French don't emigrate. That's the key fact. They don't want to leave. It may be because Canada and Mississippi didn't have good climates. They weren't New England. They were more extreme. Or it may be that maybe ordinary French people didn't live so badly in France at that time, though they complained a lot. Nobody quite knows why. There's hundreds of thousands of English are leaving, but not the French. But he's very keen on global power and on saying, I'm king of the world. I'm going to get China, Siam, America, anything.
Actually, could we say that the French who left France at the time of Louis XIV were the Huguenots when he revoked the Edict of Nantes, right?
And that's one of his major faults, revoking the Edict of Nantes and not allowing French Protestants to settle in French colonies. They were banned from French colonies. They had been before, in fact. So English colonies are full of Puritans and dissidents, but French colonies aren't. They have to be, in theory, totally Catholic. So it's a sort of weight around his feet right from the beginning. So French Huguenots leave. They settle particularly in London, Berlin, Amsterdam, and so on. But they do bring French culture with them and French crafts and arts. So in a way, they're spreading le style Louis XIV, even though they don't really like him. So it's not totally to the disadvantage of France. They make even more French the language of Europe.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Madame de Maintenon? Because although she's known as the governess of the children of Louis XIV, I mean, she had an extraordinary life. I mean, she was married before Louis XIV with an extraordinary character. Can you tell us a bit more about her?
And again, she's this facade of being very conventional, and she was far from conventional. She had her father was a murderer. She was practically born in prison. She marries Paul Scarron, who is very mal vu, who is unconventional, who's anti-monarchy, a Fronde, critical of everything, laughing at everything, possibly a free spirit, i.e. disrespectful of the church. She's there at the center of an unconventional Paris group. Everybody likes her because she's intelligent and a very good conversationalist. That's why Madame de Maintenon likes her, chooses her as governess for her children. And then she's a classic example, like a figure in a novel. Oh, the quiet one who no one really notices. Actually, she's beavering away and getting estates, getting a lot of money, marrying her niece to the Duc de Noailles, one of the leading families of France. The whole court goes to the wedding, presents pouring in from Louis XIV. So the Noailles family still has some of the estates he gave her niece. And this extraordinary web centered on her private apartment in the Palace of Versailles, where everybody writes to her, people are queuing up to see her. She sees the ministers. And she's always moaning. That's what I don't like about her. She's never cheerful. She's never saying, oh, things are going well. It's always, I think she was so tough that's what Louis XIV is like. She's the only person who really stood up to him, probably.
Yeah,
that's my interpretation. I think she's slightly like the Duchess of Windsor, Edward VIII, and really tough.
That's a good comparison.
I may be wrong. I don't know.
That's a really interesting comparison, actually. You mentioned Madame de Sévigné, whom I really love too as a writer. She's a brilliant writer. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about her perception of the court and how strong she was as well?
So Madame de Sévigné's husband has died. She's left well off. She lives in Paris. She never goes to court. Her son-in-law does a bit. I mean, if she goes to court, she never gets a court job. She's the Paris lady who goes to balls, who dances with Louis XIV, his famous occasion. But that's it. But she's a very good source of gossip. So it's another example of the court having sort of networks and filière. How do you say filière in English? Even in Paris, people don't go to court. They know exactly what's going on. I think her letters are more observant than almost anybody else's and better informed. So she is an example that Paris and the court at Versailles aren't in opposition. They sort of complement each other. They know about each other. Some people, of course, prefer Paris. It's more stimulating. You're more on a level with other people. There's more going on. Other people prefer Versailles, the king, the ministers, more jobs going, and a country life. A different. There's even now at Versailles, there's a different atmosphere from Paris. You can, in a way, get more things done because there's fewer distractions. Mm-hmm. And of course, in those days, everybody's coming through Versailles, ambassadors, foreigners, visitors, everybody, at least for a day or two. And I think Madame de Sévigné is so extraordinarily intelligent and independent, and she doesn't, as far as I know, really have boyfriends after her husband's death. She's perfectly happy just seeing a few friends, writing, listening to the news, writing to her adored daughter, and really quite an unconventional life, not dominated by other people, her own boss.
Yeah, she very much, I like that. She's very much her own boss. Actually, you can actually feel it when you read her letters. Yes. If you have a chance to find an English edition of Les Lettres de Madame de Sévigné, the letters of Madame de Sévigné, you're in for a really good reading, actually. And it's true, she's a real gossip. She's like a gossip columnist. She tells you all about what's going on. It's almost like she knows everything. It's wonderful. I mean, on a literary point of view, it's absolutely brilliant as well. So I really recommend it as a reading. There's another thing about Louis XIV, maybe you could tell us about, is how much he loved ballet.
Yep. So he's the king of the dance. He's, as a young king, and it's a French court tradition, again, like so much of his court. He's working in the French tradition. There'd been court ballets under Catherine de Médicis, and indeed earlier, even in the time of Christine de Pizan. And it's a sort of the French monarchy's answer to discontent and civil war and rebellion. Okay, let's have a ballet, and everybody behaves in order, in step. They think, they possibly even thought it would soothe rebellion. And he dances in public. He dances at the wedding of the Queen of Poland. Everybody says he's perfect, but probably in reality, there's a valet dancing in the same group with him, guiding him most of the time. And he dances in public with hours of practice, hours of dress rehearsals. And the Pavillon de Flore of the Louvre today is called after the Ballet de Flore, which was the last ballet he danced in public in 1669 in that building. But he goes on dancing in private at Marly in front of his chosen courtiers until he's 60 or 70. Amid carnival dances in 1700, 1701. So he really loved dancing. And he practices with this dance teacher whose name I've forgotten for the moment. And it's he who inspires the idea of choreography, of writing down dance steps. That comes from the French court. That's one of France's gifts to the world, choreography. And it's something that goes on in the French court right until 1789. They really are dancing to the precipice.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that comment. Actually, dancing to the precipice is really good image. I like that, absolutely. So as anybody, there's no more question in the chat. Has anybody a question? And if you want, then you can unmute yourself and ask it directly.
Hello, Melanie.
Hello, Professor Mansel. So I'm fascinated by Louis XIV as well. I never thought he was a feminist, but because men with so much control and power,
yes,
kind of are afraid of women.
Yep.
But this whole culture of luxury, like
Yep.
The shape of the shoe, his
Yep.
wigs, the beaver hats,
Yep.
Was this Louis XIV? Is he the one that cultivated France's luxury industry? Perfumes and
It's him personally, but also working in the French court tradition. In 1400, the French court was the most luxurious in Europe, with the most extraordinary jeweled objects. I saw an exhibition once about them. It was way ahead of England or Spain or Austria. And this, when there's no civil war, this always comes back under François Ier, even under Louis XIII, who was quite austere personally, but lots of luxury objects. But Louis XIV adds onto it with his cult of clothes. It's he who introduces red heels for courtiers, for male courtiers, embroidery, tapestries, very grand, luxurious furniture. When you see what metals and woods go into a Boule cabinet, you can't believe it. I mean, 80 different things go into it. And lodging the luxury craftsmen in the Louvre Palace with special privileges. He adds on to all this, and perfume and gilded architecture, the luxury that you see on the walls of Versailles, that's him also, exaggerating an existing tradition.
So the L'École des Beaux-Arts also was created under him too, the architecture.
L'Académie des Beaux-Arts.
L'Académie des Beaux-Arts,
yes.
right.
So this very, again, traditional French thing of state control of individual artists and all working for the glory of, in theory, working for the glory of the king, but in fact, working for other clients also.
Right.
So it's nice to know that it's not Louis Louboutin who actually invented the red heel, okay, the red soles, but Louis XIV himself. So that's
yes.
nice to know that.
But I've never been able
nice touch.
Never been able to find the exact incident or moment, and nobody at Versailles knows exactly when and why that happened. But he does codify it for the noblesse présentée à la cour.
Mm-hmm. But I do think there's one other thing I did read at the curator of the Musée de Carnavalet. She wrote that the robe à la Française was designed by Marie de Maintenon to hide, Montespan to hide a pregnancy, because you had the wide back that draped over, the hips, and then you
It's
had
it's
the
perfectly
cage
possible.
that the women wore.
Yes, it's
Mm.
perfectly possible because she was a major fashion innovator.
Yeah, she was a
And
fashion
she-
icon. Yeah.
Yes, and she's shown off to the ambassadors. Oh, she's got an embroidered robe, with gilt thread, and so on.
Okay.
The full history of the Grand Habit de Cour hasn't really been written because there's so many different elements in it. Maybe you should write it.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.
I remember reading a book about many years ago, at least 15 to 20 years ago, about Louis XIV as the style and how he introduced, fashion. I can't remember the name of the book now, but I will try to remember it to include it in the email that Natasha will send to all of you once we have the video. But I remember reading in that book that Louis XIV loved diamonds so much that he had diamonds on his clothes, up to one of them, the heaviest, I guess, palto, we would say, would weigh 70 pounds just because it was 70 pounds of diamonds and pearls.
Yes. It's perfectly possible. He loved jewels. He talked to individual jewelers. He and Madame de Maintenon played with jewels. They had different sets of jewels to go with different sets of clothes, depending on the colors. It's all true. And he wore a jewel embroidered coat at his last court reception, and he walked close to the ladies so they could see him in it. Yeah. But I think other monarchs also loved jewels. He probably had better ones.
Paul, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, a fascinating presentation. I appreciate your work. Taking the long view, if you evaluate all of the positive aspects of Louis XIV's reign and all of the very negative aspects, what on balance do you feel was his contribution to the development of France and to the progress of Europe? And I ask that because people condemn him for the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. They support him for the creation of so many institutions in France for culture and for commerce and so on. And yet the burden of taxation was very heavy and the finances of the court were disastrous.
Yes.
When you consider all of that together, how should we think about him?
Well, you must think every individual should think in a different way about him. But I think it was catastrophic, particularly the finances. And he came to power saying, putting Fouquet in prison and saying, I'm going to make the finances better. And he didn't. But the great difference between him and Napoleon is that he left France larger than he found it. Flanders, Franche-Comté, and Alsace, Lille, Strasbourg, and Besançon. And he built Versailles, which was a cultural and tourism asset and still is. So there is a lot to be said for him, but the finances are terrible. Privileging the court nobility is really he who begins to close the avenues to other nobles or even non-nobles. And the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, it deprives France of 200,000 brilliant people and helps his enemies. So it's then that London becomes larger than Paris. And then that Prussia and Piedmont begin to become almost great powers, which are later going to be anti-French. So he's not. It's plus. There are pluses as well as minuses. He did make a Bourbon king of Spain, his grandson. There is still a Bourbon king of Spain now. Any monarch of the time would have risked everything to do that, to make your grandson king of Spain. Even William III would have tried if he'd had a candidate. So you have to see him in the standards of his time. But what to me weighs against him is the personal cruelty to the Protestants and to all these towns he ordered to be bombarded: Brussels, Heidelberg, Genoa, Algiers, many others, the ravaging of the Rhineland.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mansel, for this wonderful Saturday afternoon talk about Louis XIV, who keeps fascinating people so many hundred years later. I highly recommend the book, and Natasha just put it again on the chat, and you can have 30% with the promo code Mansel30. So make sure you get it and read it. It's going to be a really nice reading. And I will send it back to Natasha for a final word.
Thank you
Just
very
want
much.
to thank you, Dr. Mansel, for a great presentation. Thank you all for your questions, for a fascinating conversation. And I just wanted to remind you that this event was recorded, and you can come back to the video soon. Sometime next week, I will upload it on our YouTube channel. Thank you all, and have a good end of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.